Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Translationborne, the show where we talk about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We're going to dive into things pretty quickly again this week by taking a look at some of the clothing that we found while exploring the hidden section of the Cathedral Ward. Rumpled Yharnam hat, common Yharnam cap, well worn and losing its shape. Now for the shirt. Sweaty clothes, common Yharnam clothing, well worn and damp with sweat. And as you saw there, I'm trying to expedite my process of putting in literal translations to compare to the official ones at this point. Please let me know if you have any specific thoughts regarding this change. In the meantime, though, I'd like to get back to analysis. So the one thing that stands out to me about both of those translations is the use of the term that I've translated as Old Town Yharnam in the literal version. Now, that phrasing might strike some of you as familiar. It sounds like something that they might call Old Yharnam. And in fact, that was one of the possibilities I threw out back in the episode we did on Old Yharnam when I talked about alternative titles for that location. But notably, in Japanese, the terms are not the same. What's been officially translated as Old Yharnam is Yanamu-kyu Shigai. The Japanese term for this new area, on the other hand, is Koto Yharnamu. And to get even more literal, it doesn't even mean Old Town Yharnam, it means Old Capital Yharnam. The unfortunate thing here is that there's so little context for what this could mean, it ends up being a little bit ambiguous. Is this possibly a reference to an old capital district? Considering where we picked up those clothes, under the shaft leading down past the old Healing Church workshop in the Cathedral Ward, this seems like it's at least a possibility. Alternatively, this could just be another way of referring to the city of Yharnam itself. After all, the actual clothing, as you can see by my running around in it, is what gets worn by the people who transformed into hunting beasts that we fought throughout the city of Yharnam. This, by the way, is the side that I would ultimately come down on, although it's a little bit hard to prove just from the item description itself. But even if we take this as a reference to Yharnam as a whole, some of the information in the Japanese seems to have not quite made it through in translation. If nothing else, the Japanese seems to be confirming that Yharnam was a capital city. Of course, the ambiguity that we discussed earlier could be causing something of an issue here. For that matter, consider what some of the English translations could have looked like. It could read, Common clothing in the old capital of Yharnam, or Common clothing in Yharnam, the old capital, or even Clothing common in the old capital city of Yharnam. Each of these could be misleading compared to the relatively simple Common Yharnam clothing. Also, let's not forget the possibility that this is another way of saying Old Town Yharnam, as I put in my original literal translation. Perhaps they simply wanted to emphasize the ubiquity of this particular set of clothing without getting into the ambiguities of what Koto Yharnam could be implying. Again though, it's hard to say why this particular term may have been left out. Let's instead turn our attentions to one of the most important items in the game. 1/3 of umbilical cord. A great relic, also known as the cord of the eye. Every infant great one has this precursor to the umbilical cord. Every great one loses its child, and then yearns for a surrogate. The third umbilical cord precipitated the encounter with the pale moon, which beckoned the hunters and conceived the hunter's dream. Used to gain insight and, so they say, eyes on the inside, although no one remembers what that truly entails. So if that made almost no sense to you, don't worry about it, it's not supposed to the first time through. This is one of 4 items like it in the game, each with a similar but slightly different description, and all of which are very important to the overall story Bloodborne is telling. Also, as you could probably tell, there's a great deal of information to parse on each one, and all of it is kind of confusing. So I don't really want to get into all of that just yet. Instead, I'd like to focus on the name of the item, which is interesting in its own right. In the original Japanese, this item is called Sanbonme no Heso no O, and literally this would not translate to 1/3 of an umbilical cord. This is the way that ordinal numbers, such as first, second, and third, get expressed in Japanese. In other words, rather than calling this item 1/3 of an umbilical cord, it's calling it the third umbilical cord. Also, along with this change in meaning, I think the original Japanese item name lends itself to some interesting possibilities in terms of plays on words. And I say this because the me in sanbonme also means eye. And here I think it's also important to consider that using this item will give you 3 points of enlightenment or insight. And what's one common way to depict inner wisdom and enlightenment? A third eye. Interestingly, the third eye is also referred to as the inner eye and is thought to lead to inner realms and spaces of higher consciousness. Now, I don't want to get too carried away here. Remember that the Japanese term being used for enlightenment here is keimo, and that has implications more of rational thought than it does of Buddhist enlightenment as we would think of it. Still, this item is explicitly linked with eyes. It's also known as the cord of the eye. The number 3 is important here. It gives you 3 insight, and it's called the third umbilical cord. And it's said to give you eyes on the inside. So I do think it's warranted to speculate on some possible play on words that the Japanese item name could be going for. And, now that we've taken some time to look at the Japanese version, let's consider the official English translation. The item name here is 1/3 of umbilical cord, and at first glance, this might seem like some kind of mistake. But really what I think is going on here is a subtle attempt to feed you some key information about the game. Bloodborne has 3 different possible endings, and one of them specifically requires you to consume 3 of this item. So by calling it a 1/3 of umbilical cord, you get the idea that consuming 3 of them gives you a whole umbilical cord. Now, there is a bit of a cryptic note that you can find at a later point in the game that says 3/3 cords. We'll talk about that more when we get there, but I think it's a more effective hint if you already have the idea that you're going to need 3 of these things you have 1/3 of. As for the possible play on words in the Japanese version, I feel like there's a pretty good stand-in that you can get from the English, because this is another point where I think the translation of enlightenment as insight really pays dividends. Right here in this single item description, you have the concept of insight right by the phrase, eyes on the inside. And this also serves as a way to get at the idea of a third eye, because remember that eye is also frequently referred to as the inner eye. And even beyond that, the use of the term insight and the connection it has to eyes on the inside gives new significance to the fact that when you use this item, you get 3 insight. So you still have some potential links to the concept of a third eye. The importance of the number 3 remains highlighted, although in a slightly different way. And in this version, you get the additional bonus of a hint as to how to achieve one of the more hidden endings. So with all of that in mind, I'd say that I personally would find this to be an effective translation choice. But we'll talk more about these items as we continue to explore the rest of the game. Let's turn now to something else. Bloodshot Eyeball, material used in a holy chalice ritual. An exquisite eyeball removed quickly after death, or perhaps even before, used to unlock the seal of the old labyrinth Hintertombs. And as you can see, this is a pretty straightforward translation. The thing that I'd say is the most intriguing about this particular item description is actually the name of the area in the underground labyrinth that this item is said to help unlock. In Japanese, the area is referred to as the Hekihaka Kukaku, where Kukaku is a reference to a district or a region, and Hekihaka appears to be a made-up term. Now, the haka in Hekihaka just means grave. There's nothing very exceptional about the term or the kanji being used to display it. The heki part of the word, on the other hand, is considerably more rare. It's associated with things that are twisted and abnormal, but it's also used to denote a place that is something of a backwater. And I think this particular meaning comes through especially well in the English translation. The prefix of hinter literally gets at the idea of something that's behind you. When someone's talking about the hinterland, they're essentially talking about the back country. These are places that are not as advanced as other parts of the world. So the newly coined term of hintertomb accurately communicates the idea of graves that are considered to be somehow lesser than those in the main parts of the underground labyrinth. It also has the benefit of rolling off the tongue quite nicely. It sounds like a natural English word. And while we're on the topic of sounding natural, I'd say that another nice change I appreciate is from the more literal, a beautiful eyeball plucked out right after death, or perhaps while the person is still alive, to the official, an exquisite eyeball removed quickly after death, or perhaps even before. The use of the term exquisite as opposed to beautiful, I think really helps to bring out some of the creepiness that's going on here. Beautiful implying only visual splendor, whereas exquisite brings a little bit more to the mind, to me almost implying that these eyeballs might be eaten. Also, I find that ending the sentence with the implication that these eyes may have been removed before death, i.e., that they may have been pulled out of people who were still alive, is more impactful than spelling out that same possibility. The former allows the reader to make the connection themselves and be horrified, while the latter simply provides the information and relies on that to be creepy. These are relatively small touches, but I think they go a long way towards adding polish and atmosphere to even this relatively short and straightforward item description. Again, one thing I really appreciate about the translation of Bloodborne is the tone that they've managed to achieve. That this comes through in item descriptions and dialogues alike, I think is great. But that's enough on the Bloodshot eyeball. Let's take a look now at another item that has a lot of direct story significance. Old Hunter Bone. The bone of an old hunter whose name is lost. It is said that he was an apprentice to old Gehrman, and a practitioner of the art of quickening, a technique particular to the first hunters. It is most appropriate that hunters, carriers of the torch who are sustained by the dream, would tease an old art from his remains. So as you can see, there is a lot going on with this translation. One of the most notable, for lore reasons that hopefully we'll get into later, is the use in the English translation of the pronoun he, while the Japanese avoids the use of any such gendered pronouns. But it's also worth remarking on because this is something that crops up a lot in Japanese to English translation. In the Japanese language, it's not especially difficult to avoid the use of third-person gendered pronouns entirely. Let's just look back at that item description where we have that name, that hunter, those remains, that will. Those are the references being made there. The problem is that this sounds really clunky in English, and ideally this is where the translator would go to the original creator to find out the actual intention. Sadly though, there are a lot of times when this isn't an option. A lot of the time a translator will have to guess one way or another, usually defaulting male, or leave things really clunky. Suffice it to say, this wasn't necessarily a bad translation choice. But in the case of this specific item, we'll have to revisit things a little bit later when we have more of the lore. Before we move on though, there's one more thing about this item I think it's important to highlight, and this once again involves the item name. The official translation is Old Hunter Bone, which perfectly matches the visual we get of the item. But the original Japanese would more literally translate to something like the remains of an old hunter. And this is something that I think is notable because while the Japanese term in question does apply specifically to the bones of the deceased, there's a connection being made with the Japanese term for blood echoes that I think it's easier to lose track of in translation. That's one of the things the final paragraph of the description is calling out explicitly. It's fitting that hunters, who empower themselves on the dying will of blood, would use physical remains to gain strength as well. To get even more literal, we have remaining will on the one hand and physical remains on the other. It's an interesting parallel, and one I think the official translation, to its credit, does a good job of maintaining about as well as it can. But at this point, I think it's time we turn to a new item description, one that also leads to a unique interaction. Small Hair Ornament. A small, very ordinary hair ornament. Although it has been lost for quite some time, one can still see signs of the care with which this tasteful ornament was once kept. Its color would stand out most brilliantly against a head of grayish hair. And now, recalling that we found this in what seems to have been the source for the hunter's dream with the rest of the doll set, let's go ahead and talk to the doll. Maybe if we give this to her, she'll have something new to say.
What? What is this? I can't remember. Not a thing, only I feel. A yearning, something I never felt before. What's happening to me? Tell me, Hunter. Could this be joy?
And now we have the tear stone, as well as a lot to analyze. So let's start out by going back and talking about the hair ornament. For the most part, this is a fairly straightforward translation. There are even a few points where changes may appear to be larger than they actually are just by comparing a literal translation to the official one. For instance, what I've rendered hair color that resembles ash might seem like a big change compared to grayish hair, except that the Japanese word for gray literally breaks down into ash-colored. So while I do think the final line of that particular item description does contain the most interesting translation choice, I'm more curious about something that seems to have been left out as opposed to altered. Because while the core idea that this hair ornament would be paired most effectively with a head of grayish hair is preserved, the original Japanese includes a short phrase meant to indicate that the ornament also wouldn't stand out too much. You might say that the hair ornament would stand out most elegantly against the doll's hair as opposed to most brilliantly. The idea that this ornament would go well with the doll's hair while at the same time being fairly restrained, that it would accentuate her hair quietly, to get more literal, I think says something about both the doll's character and about the person who kept the ornament with such care. And on that note, I want to go back to something that pretty much everything associated with the doll's clothing brings up. The hair ornament, as we've just seen, tells us that one can still see signs of the care with which this tasteful ornament was once kept. Likewise, on every item in the doll set, we can see that a deep love for the doll can be surmised by the fine craftsmanship of this article and the care with which it was kept. But the items in the doll set then go on to give us a little bit more information. The official English continues, "It borderlines on mania and exudes a slight warmth." Now, this sentence is structured a little bit awkwardly and possibly on purpose, so looking at a literal translation of the original Japanese I think would be helpful. That, presumably the care with which these items were kept, resembles monomania, and as a result, this, likely the article of clothing in question, is slightly warm. The implication seems to be that all of these things related to the doll received such a maniacal level of care that they've been imbued with physical warmth. So, why bring this up now? Because of what the doll says when we give her the hair ornament. Recall that in my literal translation, the doll has a line where she says, "I feel a warmth." This has never happened before. And there does seem to be that parallel with the word warmth in the original Japanese. Even the kanji used to depict the word in the original is the same, though based on the context, the meaning of the word appears to be different. Arguably, this is being done to represent a cycle. We've seen a maniacal level of emotion manifest as physical warmth. The doll then experiences this and reacts with the first instance of an emotional warmth that she's ever had. The Japanese, therefore, seems to be making a connection by using both senses of the term warmth. The official translation, on the other hand, makes the interesting choice to take you on a similar journey via a different path. Because in the official translation, the doll doesn't say she feels a warmth, she says she feels a yearning. Arguably then, the process implied by the official translation is that the doll notices the care with which the hair ornament was kept, gets a sense for the yearning or warmth that was directed towards her, which is also the source of the physical warmth of the items in the doll set, and then she experiences joy. And it's on that happy note that I'm going to end the episode. As always, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, please do let me know. Thanks for watching, everyone.